Well, thanks, Mom, for joining me. I'm excited to chat. I'm excited to talk about this with you. So thanks for hopping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. All right, so let's just start at the beginning. Let's start from before we've made any contact with your birth family, and let's start with your growing up. When did you first learn that you were adopted?
That's a great question. I feel like I just always kind of knew. I think that my parents just talked about it even when I was a tiny baby. And I remember my mom later in my life when I was probably an adult telling me that somewhere along the line she'd been told just talk about adoption, just use the word adoption. And so that it just kind of becomes normal. And so she said she used to call Grant and then me her little adopted darlings. That's what she would say about us. I think just to get herself used to saying it, because I think it was a little bit hard for her, the whole adoption thing and just everything around infertility. It was difficult. So it took her some time to get used to saying that. But so I just always knew. And in my opinion, that's the best way to do it because it just felt very normal and there was no shame or weirdness attached to it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned your brother Grant,
Okay.
who was also adopted.
Okay.
I know that it's impossible to know the other side, but did you feel that there was support there, or knowing that you weren't the only adopted one in the family, that two out of the three
Yeah.
kids were adopted? Was there? Do you think that removed maybe some stigma or just the idea of adoption being odd? Because when it came to
Yeah.
your siblings, the majority, again, that two out of three were adopted, so it wasn't that weird.
Right. You're right, Tommy. I'd never thought about that, but probably. I to me it just felt so normal that I didn't analyze it. As a little kid, you just sort of accept whatever's happening. And I didn't stop to really think about it. But I think you're right. I mean, in our family, adoption was normal. And then as I grew up, I would meet people, other kids my age that were adopted, and that just seemed kind of cool. Like you're kind of in a cool kids club a little bit. So yeah, that I think that's how it was sort of handled in our family.
I think that's awesome because obviously, I mean, I'm not adopted, but just seeing how it's sometimes talked about, whether it's in media or my brain goes to Cheaper by the Dozen, the
Yes.
newish one,
FedEx.
where right, yeah. So
Yeah,
to kind of
right.
to bully one of their siblings, essentially, they tell him that he's adopted, that he was dropped off
Yeah.
by FedEx, right?
Yeah,
And it's just
exactly.
this derogatory thing. So I love that growing up from the get go, it was this positive thing.
I
And
know. Me too.
and going on from that, when did you first hear any details? Which I know that there weren't a ton, but any details about your
Mhm.
um, birth parents? When was the first time that you remember hearing your adoptive parents talk about them?
Um, well, okay, so the same thing. I don't remember my parents first telling me the story because they told the story enough that I have a really distinct memory of being very young. I don't know how young. Maybe 5. That seems to be when most of my memories that I can kind of think back to happened. Saying, "Tell me the story of the day you got me." And they had this whole story that they would tell. They got the phone call. They went to the help department or whatever it was called. Um, and then they would say, and we just looked down and we just saw these big blue eyes. And we were like, "That's our girl." Or they had some little thing like that. And then we had to run to the store because we didn't have anything like, baby stuff. They just didn't have
Mm-hmm.
any, and especially nothing for a girl. So we had to do that. And then we went to this relative's house. And then we went to this relative's house to show off our new baby, and it was exciting. And then there was also a story for my brother, and I'd say, "Well, tell me Grant's story." Or if he was there, he'd say, "Tell me my story." And so it just it felt like, I mean, at some point in my growing up, to me, being adopted was the best. Like, that's how it kind of felt. Like, I didn't see it as a deficit. I sort of felt bad for kids that didn't have a story. And
Yeah.
I I just thought it was the way to do it, right? And so that, I guess, just from the very start, I don't know when they kind of put that all together. I wish they were still here. I could ask them,
Hmm.
you know, but it's fun. It's fun. It's ingrained in it's a core memory, as people say now, you
Yes.
know?
Uh-huh.
Yep.
And I'm curious because you talk about having this feeling about being adopted added kind of some coolness, some extra awesomeness. When you
Hmm.
were a kid and you were thinking about your future and potentially having a family of your own,
Hmm.
did adopting yourself ever cross your mind? And if it did,
Yeah.
how so?
Oh, totally. I think really in the sense that I there were no barriers to it. I think for most families or people, and I'm just supposing here because I haven't ever lived the other way, right? But
Hmm.
if I hadn't been adopted and all of a sudden I was faced with the fact that for whatever reason I couldn't have my own child and adoption might be an option, I would think it would take me a minute to wrap my head around that idea. For me, it just felt like, well, of course, that would make total sense. And in my head, I sort of thought, well, maybe I'll have some of my own. Maybe I'll adopt some. It just felt like a very open door. And of course, we never did that. Dad and I were able to have a whole bunch of kids on our own.
Hmm.
um, but very open to that idea.
Yeah, and while you were growing up and you were hearing the story of your parents getting you, and you're thinking about potentially adopting kids in the future, and you have this really positive outlook on adoption, were there ever any curiosities about figuring out who these people were, these your birth parents? And I'm curious too, I know it's
Mhm.
not great to ask two questions at once, but I keep saying
No.
birth parents and then
Hmm.
adoptive parents. What kind of terminology did you use growing up when referring to both
Hmm.
sets of human beings?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, mom and dad, that
Hmm.
was Beth and Slim. They were my parents.
Hmm.
They raised me. They adopted me. Um, and then they would talk about my birth mom. That's how they talked about her. We didn't know any names or anything like that. We didn't talk about birth dad. That I remember. I don't know if he just wasn't necessary to talk about or what it was, but we didn't talk about him. So, um, and then okay, I've already forgot the other question.
That's okay. Um, were there levels of curiosity while you were
Oh
growing
yeah.
up to know more about birth mom?
Definitely there was. And it really didn't become a thing for me that seemed realistic until I was in college because I was adopted in Idaho. The records were sealed. I had friends that were adopted. Nobody had an open adoption that I knew of. If you were adopted, it went through the courts. That record was completely sealed. You didn't have access to it. Your parents didn't have access to it. I didn't know anybody that had access to it. So it wasn't something that I'd even really considered. I don't think for myself, I experienced my own set of challenges as a teenager, but in my mind, none of those related to being adopted. And so I wasn't feeling angst like, "Oh, I wish I knew," or like, my parents don't understand me, and therefore I wish I could find my adopted parents. Or I think in my head, for whatever reason, it just kind of felt like I was in the place I was meant to be, and I felt really settled about that. Then I went to college, and I um, worked as a grader for a guy that taught child development. And as part of that, I met a woman who was doing her master's, PhD, I can't remember, but she was very curious about adoption. And so we would just talk, and she had lots of questions for me. And the more we talked about it, we both kind of said, there's lots of clubs and things at BYU. I went to Brigham Young University. There's lots of clubs here, but there's really nothing about adoption. And so we went through the process of creating a club for around adoption. We called it the Adoption Forum. And once a month, we would have a meeting and we'd have a speaker, and it would be either somebody who had adopted or a birth parent or an adoptee that would come, or a group or a panel. They would come and they would kind of just talk to us. And there were lots of people that joined. When we did it, I was kind of thinking, is anyone going to find that very interesting? But people did, and I think anything around our identity, our genealogy, our history, our nationality, all those things, our ethnicity, they're deep in our souls. We want to feel deeply connected to ourselves and to our past. And so people were curious about it. That being a part of that really taught me so much, because we really did get to hear from every single angle. And especially those birth mamas. I really hadn't, up to that point, had a chance to really hear a birth mom's story. And I just remember this one panel in particular. I think there was 3 birth moms there, and all their stories were different, but they were all just so touching and deeply hard and sweet, but difficult, and to kind of hear from their perspective what that was like, it just really created a lot of empathy for me, within me, I guess. But then and that's true too for the people that were adopting. I mean, most people aren't adopting because they just don't have any other issues and they're just like, let's just adopt kids. Some people maybe do that, but for a lot of folks, they've gone through some type of infertility, or they've had some experience where they just feel like that's their mission in life, or not maybe a mission, but just like a calling, that they're to welcome different kids into their home. And so it's very personal, and for a lot of people, very spiritual. And so it was awesome. It was a very cool experience. It taught me a lot, made me kind of think about myself a little bit. But then this is turning into a long story, but that really kind of put me in a place where I said, I really want to know more. And I went home. I talked to my parents about it because I knew it would be a little bit touchy. One thing that I knew my mom had gone through a lot of personal pain around infertility. And that stuff kind of sticks with you unless you have a way to work through it. And nobody really did therapy in the 70s and 80s, 50s, 60s. I mean, it just wasn't as common. People did it, but it wasn't as common. And so I don't think that she'd had a chance to really address some of that trauma that had really been deep inside her heart. And so, anyway, I knew that this was going to be potentially just a little hard, because I wanted to make it clear, like, I'm not looking for someone to replace you. I just really want to know about myself. And both my parents are very open to it. They were open to talking about it. They told me everything they knew. Um, they got me in touch. They knew the social worker that had helped them through the process. So they got me her number. She was still alive. I called and spoke with her. There wasn't a lot she could tell me. Um, they helped me get in touch with the health department, and I got a very didactic story about myself, about my birth mom and birth father, where when my birth mom had gone in and they'd met with her, sat down with her, they'd taken lots and lots of notes. Well, then somebody just went through it and read a few things to me over the phone that were very unidentifying, and then typed up kind of a one-page summary of things that they could share at the time. That was probably in 1988. And records are still sealed. There's no internet. And at that point, people were hiring private investigators, and there were groups that you could join that you could go to meetings and they would give you hints on how to do it. I just I kind of got some of the information I got at that time and felt content. I just felt like it was enough, and I just set it down at that point and didn't pick it up again for a long time, as you know.
Yes. And I remember growing up and reading and having you read
Mhm.
that little blurb, because
Yeah.
as a kid it felt um I mean, it was kind of storybookish a little bit, kind of like
Mhm.
riddles and rhymes, of just little details about this person who by blood is my grandma,
Yeah.
and affect that affects me so much on a scientific level. Um,
Mhm.
and this person who is such a literal part of our family that we don't know about, and it felt so kind of mythical. It was because I remember
Yeah.
some of the details being like hair color and eye color,
Mhm.
maybe. Um,
Yeah.
and I remember thinking like she could be anywhere. She could be our neighbor. How crazy would that be
Mhm.
if,
Right.
she's right there or whatever it might be, and just having it be kind of this mystical thing. But
Yeah.
as you explained, hearing that much left you content
Mhm.
for a while.
Mhm.
And let's fast forward to that part. Um,
Okay.
when when did that change? When the when you had before was enough?
Mhm.
What changed to make you want to find out more?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, I think technology changed, honestly. So I I got well, I mean, you just stay curious. I think if you're adopted, you're curious and
Hmm.
you would like to know more. But it's a Pandora's box. You kind of recognize I might find out my birth mom is in prison or shot somebody, or I mean, you could find out some really horrible things, or maybe they're just a normal human. You could also find them and they are like, don't want to meet you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. That could be really painful. I don't know. I mean, there's just so many scenarios, right? And so I think you kind of play all those out in your head, or at least I did. And and then Ancestry, I don't know when it became a company. I mean, it was I want to say that that was back in the 90s. Am I wrong about that? I don't know. I mean, so I feel like they kind of entered the scene way before I decided to take a test. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seemed like it was the 90s that they
I
became
yeah,
a company.
either the '90s or the early thousands, but just knowing your
Hmm.
timeline, it was definitely before
Right.
you started doing stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't really know how it worked. And then even when I got curious and comfortable enough to take a test, I still didn't totally understand the whole ancestry thing. I just
Oh yeah.
kind of thought I would get maybe a background of you're this much Norwegian because I knew I had some Norwegian. That was in those papers we had. You're this
Okay.
much and you're maybe from this country a little bit, or but I didn't anticipate that it was gonna all of a sudden I was gonna be connected to all these cousins. So let me just finish out that story. So I felt comfortable in taking the test, and I got the test, and I think it must have been the fall of 2015. And my mom passed away right around that time too. Yeah, so I'm really thinking about a lot of things, and I'm wanting this deeper connection. And my dad has already died, and so I am feeling a little orphaned, and I'm just interested, curious, and I decided to take the test. Well, I took it in the fall, and like I said, all of a sudden I was connected to hundreds of people, none of whom I recognized their names. They all seemed completely foreign to me. They lived all over the country. Some of them were maybe as close, like maybe it would say even like second cousin, I mean, which seemed pretty close. But Ancestry just kind of they're giving you a range. Like if you're in this range, you might be a second cousin. It might be an aunt. It might be something.
Mhm.
But nobody that I could, that I'd ever heard of or could relate to at all. So it was the next spring that I hopped into Ancestry because you have to hop in. It's like Facebook or something in order to see if you have messages. I wasn't checking it all the time. And there's all of a sudden there's a first cousin, and it was a gentleman, and I was like, whoa, that's cool. By then I'd realized you could DM each other. There was some way to like send messages back and forth. So I just popped in into his DMs and I just said, hey, it looks like we're related. I just left it at that because I kind of felt like, I'm not going to just blurt my story to everybody. We'll play by ear with different people. And so he got right back to me and he said, yeah, it says we're first cousins, but I don't remember you at all from family reunions. Um, Tell me who you are. So then I just told him my story. I said, of course you wouldn't know me. I was adopted. And so then if you remember correctly too, we have a neighbor who works for Ancestry, and she was super helpful, helping me sort of create this genogram, or like a little tree, like a genealogy family tree, and leaving open spaces, because once you kind of figure some things out, the first things it will tell you are your ancestors that are like maybe your great grandparents or your great great grandparents, because they can pin that down pretty easily. You are definitely related to this person and this person. And then it becomes like a puzzle. You have to start working through, where were these siblings? And did these siblings, did they live to marrying age or to childbearing age? And you just have to kind of go through it. And so I had some different options, and she helped me sort of narrow down to this one family that had four daughters and one son. And as I stalked them, as one will on Facebook, um, or I don't know how I figured this out. I probably said in there, but one of the daughters had passed away already, but everybody else was still alive. The grandparents were not alive, and so it had to be one of these daughters. So I reached back out. Well, in the meantime, this happened. I couldn't find that paper that you talked about that we had read when you were a little boy. I couldn't find it. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know. We moved here, and I had it stuck away somewhere. It's probably still in the journal or something somewhere. So I called the health department in Boise, Idaho, where I was born. And I told them my story. Hey, I'm doing Ancestry. I'm down to a couple of people, and I can't find this paper. And I know it had clues in it, and I just need to get another copy of it. Could you send that? And they said, sure. And so a week or so later, I get 3 pages of material that were copied, not somebody taking material out and retyping, copied, and then a Sharpie is running through names and dates. But it had really specific information on there. I appreciate whoever that person was. I don't know if Idaho's changed their policies or if you just were doing me a favor, but it really was amazing because it just told me so much more about my birth mom's history and how she kind of got into this place where she found herself pregnant and needing to relinquish a kid. And it was great. And so then I reached out to my cousin and I said, "Hey, this is what I just got from the health department." Take a picture, sent it to him. And he then went to each of those sisters that were still alive and said, "Hey, I found somebody on Ancestry that says," well, this is kind of funny. He actually just called the oldest sister and said, "Hey, did you have a baby in 1969?" I'm thinking, who says that, right? I mean, like, what a question. And
Yeah.
she was like, "No, I did not," you know? And so then both other sisters, they're like, "No, I didn't. No, I didn't." And so it must have been the sister that had passed. And so then when I had this information from the health department that really told more about her story, it became really obvious really fast it was her. And the thing that was really interesting to me, it's still fascinating and sad, and I don't, lots of feelings about it, is that she did not tell her sisters or her parents. I don't think she even told her best friend that she was pregnant. She just took that information inside, held it, got herself to Boise, had a baby, and here I am now. But nobody knew. She didn't tell anybody before or after. So just kind of an interesting part of her history and maybe her personality and some of the things that she was dealing with at the time.
I mean, so fascinating. The entire process of piecing it all together, this added element that you mentioned that nobody knew. They were learning about you at the same time that you were learning about them. It's not like there was this long lost person out there and you finally answered the call. Your
Right.
surprise. As you were going through this process and finding more individuals who you were related to and getting closer and closer to the answer about who your birth mom was there ever a hesitation to stop the process and just say, you know what, maybe I don't want to know? As you mentioned, it could go through so many ways, and as you were finding things out, did any of that spook you to a point where you're like, maybe I'll just stop here, and I've lived in ignorance my whole life in terms of this specifics. I'll just keep doing it. Did that ever cross your mind?
No, not really. I think I felt ready for whatever it was,
Uh-huh.
whatever the circumstances were. I felt ready for it. And I do have to say, this cousin that I met on there was so kind. And his story was his wife was totally into family history. She loves genealogy. So she was the one that had gifted him the ancestry test for Christmas. And then that's why his results can hit in the spring. That it takes after Christmas, I think a lot of people take it, and it takes a couple months to get all those things done. And so they said immediately when we realized that we were related, they said, "Let's have a phone call." And they were so welcoming and kind and wonderful. And she even said something to me that really hit me. She said, "You are a blessing to this family. You are such a blessing to this family." And it really humbled me. It kind of tears me up, but I just felt like because this is one thing I think being an adopted kid is that you came on the scene at a chaotic time. You know that there was some crisis going on. There was some reason that that person said, "I can't raise you." And you don't want to come in and just blow up people's lives as an adult. I didn't. And so hearing that from her, I just thought, yeah, I am a blessing. That's right. I'm not so bad. And I also really had the attitude like, I am not coming in with any expectations. I'm just I'm just open hearted and open minded and curious. And so I don't have any expectations. And I I'm not looking for anything. I'm not here to try to fleece the family. I mean, there's so many things, right? I'm not interested in any of that. I just am really just wanting to learn. And so I feel like that like just helped me so much. And then he was so willing to reach out to his cousins who are my aunts, my aunties, and ask them questions and talk to them and share my story. And then what we learned was my birth mom had passed away, and her name is, I feel like I should do a little drum roll because it's the same name as
Mm-hmm.
mine. It's Susan, which
Mm-hmm.
was a complete shock to everybody. Anybody I tell that to says, "Well, did your mom know? Did your mom and dad know?" And I'm just like, "No," because if they would have known, I know they would not have named me that. And it's not because they're mean people, it's because there was this little sense of insecurity, like you want this baby to be your baby. And they wanted, you know what I mean? And so I just
Mm-hmm.
don't think they would have done that. I think they would have gone another direction, but they didn't. And so call it coincidence, call it inspiration, call it whatever you want. It's pretty cool that we have the same name. So she passed away when she was 44. And so she'd been gone a long time. But after she'd given birth to me, she got married and she had two more daughters. And so my aunts, I talked to them, and then they said, "Hey, would you like to talk to your half sisters?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so they reached out to them. So I feel like my family really took care of this for me. They eased the path for people, my side and the other side, to kind of make introductions almost. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so that whole process, it was kind of like just one step at a time. This step feels comfortable. This step feels comfortable. And it just ended up working out, you know?
Yeah, and before, and I definitely want to talk about um, meeting your half sisters, but before
Mm-hmm.
we get there, when you were speaking with these relatives, this first cousin, eventually the aunties,
Mm-hmm.
what what did it do for your heart, your soul, um, to be speaking with people that you were blood related to for the first time in your life? Because
Mm-hmm.
you're, how old are you at this point, if I can ask?
Yeah, for sure. So it was about 10 years ago. So I would have been about 45, 44, 45.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's been a long time. So it, it's interesting that you would ask that because I remember when I first had your older brother, um, looking at him and thinking, this is my first blood relative that I've ever known, and having that be pretty profound. But, and that was awesome. And I loved that. And then I had four more kids after that. And it was great. I think though, meeting these people that had sort of a shared history, just talking to them, it was so soul filling. I don't know another word to say it. I didn't feel like I had a hole from being adopted that I needed to fill, but I must have, because I felt like meeting them sort of filled up this hole. It answered questions for me that I didn't even know I should be asking, partly because, you've got your DNA and you've got your place you're raised, you've got nature versus nurture. And I just sort of assumed, I think, that a lot of my personality and just different things that I had either dealt with or talents I had, whatever, kind of came through how I was raised. And I think a lot of it did. But meeting this more DNA family, I recognize, holy cow, I mean, your DNA is so strong. And I have so much in common, just interest wise, just, of course, looks, but also just personality, life outlook. I don't know, just some really interesting things that you don't necessarily think about as being part of your DNA, that are definitely there. So it kind of answered some questions that way. And it was so awesome, honestly. It was just awesome. So yeah, it was good. And as well as I have to mention this too, being able to go back in my history and read stories about former ancestors that I was related to, because I had my adopted family's stories, your ancestor stories, and they're still so precious to me. They're part of who I am. I will always think of that as my family. But I added to that, and it was just such an interesting, fun, sort of a, I don't know, I guess it's like when anybody does genealogy, you sort of feel this deeper connection to who you are and your time on this planet. Like it just kind of creates more meaning for you. And that's what that did for me. And it was awesome. I loved it.
Yeah, I love that. Just adding to the lore, as they say.
Yeah, the
Um,
lore. Exactly.
yeah, just the background, the history, and being able to make those connections. I love what you mentioned about the DNA aspect and the family aspect going deeper than, well, this is what your hair color is, eye color is, um,
Yeah.
disposition to, predisposition to, I don't know, flour and other foods, whatever. It goes so
Right.
much deeper than all that. And
Yes.
I want to get to you meeting your half sisters because growing up, as I mentioned, you're one of three kids and the only girl, so you didn't have any sisters in the home. You had best friends, of course,
Mm-hmm.
who you considered sisters, but in terms of having a
Mm-hmm.
sister, just wasn't a part of your life ever up until this point.
Right.
And so
Right.
let's start at that part of the story where you get
Mm-hmm.
connected with them.
Okay. So our aunties introduce us, and we have some phone calls together, and it's really great. By now it's summertime. I am feeling like I want to go meet them. And I mention it, and I'm thinking they might be like, I don't know, who knows,
Right.
right? I mean, it's so weird to get this brand new family member. What are you going to do with them? And they said, awesome, let's do it. And so we chose a place to go meet. They each had two kids. And so at that point, um, I decided to take my two daughters with me. And I felt like it would be really interesting for them. I felt like it would be really fun for my aunties and sisters to meet them. They look a lot like my birth mom. Um, I felt like they were the same ages as their cousins that they were going to go meet. It just kind of made sense to just take them and and then I also selfishly felt like I need somebody there, and then it left Dad here to kind of run the show with everybody else. And so it was it was kind of just a move on my part. I felt like this kind of makes sense to me. And so I flew out, and I was so nervous. And I didn't realize I was going to be that nervous. It wasn't like I was having anxiety over like, will they like me? Will they accept me? I already knew by then they were super cool people, and that they were the kind of people, if I met them in a neighborhood, I would want to hang out with them. Like it just felt really, really cool that way. But I just felt so much. I think that there was just so much in my mind and in my heart. I just felt so nervous. And I remember just sort of sweating when I first met him. And it was very, very warm as well. And just feeling this kind of like, oh my gosh, but they were just the funnest and so sweet. I ended up that weekend getting to meet my cousin and his wife and all my aunts and another cousin, and um and then my sisters and their families, and we went and did fun things together. We talked a lot. We looked at pictures. I put a scanner on my phone. I scanned all these pictures, and we just spent a few days together kind of getting acquainted, and it was just great. left it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite stories. When all that was happening, it's just a fascinating experience, and it was so fun to see you meet them and find your family. And of course, it's my family too, but just on this level of you being able to find sisters, and
Mm-hmm.
because it was kind of a theme. I remember growing up that you didn't have sisters, so you do have a best friend who we called Aunt growing up,
Mm-hmm.
and to have, not to disparage her, of course, but to have real aunts and real sisters, it was just so new and so fun because it was something that I never thought would happen. And I'm sure at
Right.
some point in your life, or maybe for most of your life, you probably didn't think that would happen either. So for
Right.
this to happen, and for it to happen in such a positive way too, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
it could go so many different ways, especially
Mm-hmm.
with kind of the secretive nature of
Yeah.
your coming abouts.
Right.
There could be lots of feelings there, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean to say that there aren't, but there evidently there were more more powerful feelings of let's connect and
Mm-hmm.
let's get together, and I think that's so cool. It's so
Mm-hmm.
awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So when you first realized or made a connection and it was figured out who your birth mom was,
Mm-hmm.
and in that same breath found out that she had passed away a long
Mm-hmm.
time ago, how did that first make you feel, learning about her existence and her death at the same time?
Well, that's such a good question, Tommy. It was the whole experience was such a mix of emotions after learning about her and then, getting to know my sisters by phone and then meeting them. I just I remember telling your dad, I think I have felt every single emotion you could feel through this whole thing. But just um so excited to learn more and interested and appreciative and then also heartbroken, sad. Um sort of I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but maybe a little disappointed, like that would have been great to have met her. Um but also sad about the circumstances of her life and death because she hadn't died a happy death. I mean, not that anybody dies a happy death, but you know what I mean. I mean, there's she'd had a hard life. She abused alcohol. She'd kind of crashed and burned in my mind a little bit, and I didn't feel disparaging about that toward her or like I didn't wish it was different, but I wished I could have got to know her. And I feel like too, as I got to know her story, I did get to understand her better and where her pain came from. And interestingly enough, watching myself in my own life and how I handle things, and then watching my kids, how we all do things, kind of understood her a little bit better. That she was very private, obviously keeping me a secret. And not how many people can do that, really, and never let it slip out. Um, maybe just very closed off. I don't know, just feeling a little broken inside. I'm not sure. Who knows what all her feelings were, but just kind of understanding that it was difficult for her to ask for help, and she didn't ask for help that I know of. She got help, but it was in the midst of a crisis. Her parents were very helpful and they stepped in. And so, which I'm so appreciative that I have that kind of grandparents that would do that. She, I felt kind of I guess I felt like if she was my friend, I would feel a little heartbroken for how things went in her life in some ways. And then in some ways, I'm so grateful to her. I think that the way she handled my birth was a complete gift to me. I, I can I tell that part really fast?
For sure.
Okay. So she lived in in the Bay Area in California. She got pregnant there. Um, and I'll even back up a little further. She had married her high school sweetheart after high school, and he'd gone off to the Vietnam War and he'd been killed. And that, I think, had a really profound effect on her and her life, her faith, her outlook about life, and just herself. I'm assuming. Anyway, so she ends up getting pregnant. She doesn't tell anyone. I don't think she probably told the birth father, my birth father. I would be highly doubtful that she told him. She, at some point, says to her sisters, I'm going on a trip. And I was born in January. She would have conceived in April. So I'm guessing it was the fall or late winter, I'm thinking. And she said, I'm going to be a little while. I'm going to go visit some cousins. They lived in the Dakotas. And, but I'm going to be gone for a while. And she just did it. She got in the car. I don't think she'd ever been to Idaho before. She drove to Boise. She must have researched how to relinquish a baby. She got in contact with the health department, which was who did it at that time in Idaho. She had her interviews or whatever. I'm assuming she's staying in a hotel somewhere. She goes to the hospital. She has me. She signs the paperwork and she drives on to the Dakotas and meets up with these cousins, and nobody knows. And eventually she goes back home. She works, she meets somebody. She's married by the end of 1969. I was born in January. She was married by October. And so my sisters were all just like 2.5 years apart. So I think was a strong person in a lot of ways. I think that she had grit and determination. I think she gave me a gift. My life was a gift from her. And so I've always felt like that. And I still do feel like that. But it's mixed with a lot of other emotions too, you know? So
Absolutely.
there you go.
Absolutely. And yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and it is it takes a certain type of person to be able to do all that. And I think a lot of the words you use are applicable: grit, strong, brave, a lot of things. And a couple of themes I want to touch on from your story. You learned early on in your life, as you mentioned, from your first memories, that you were at one point an orphan who was adopted by a
Right.
loving family.
Right.
And then you mentioned when your parents passed away, you felt a little orphaned. And in a sense, you find another family who is a family that you haven't ever been in contact with, but they welcome you with open arms. And I know that the word adoption might not make total sense in this case because you are blood related, but in a lot of ways, in terms of like socially and just being part of the family in a way that I know that you are, you've been adopted into this circle as well. So the double orphaning and the double adoption at different periods in your life by different families, I guess how does that feel to have kind of these two different moments of having a family, losing a family, and then gaining a family? Like I it just feels like it's happened twice now in your life successfully in different ways. So how does that feel to you?
Yeah. I guess, I mean, it feels really lucky.
Mm-hmm.
It feels really like a huge blessing because people don't have to love you. People don't have to accept you. People don't have to give you their time. You know, I really did go in without any expectations. I feel like when you're a little kid, you think that your parents' whole life revolves around you. And so that's a little bit different, right? I just assumed that my parents would always be there for me. They would always love me, and they did. But but this second go around, I didn't have any expectations. I just wanted to meet them, and they were open to meeting me too, and they made the effort. People traveled and came to meet me where I was staying, and so it was it was really great. I really appreciate it. I feel like I don't know how to say this except that everybody that I met was just a really good, decent human. And that was really profound to me. That meant a lot to me. Like, that's who I want to be related to. And it was powerful. It was really powerful.
So, jumping off from that, what are some kind of what some people might think are kind of small things, but for you meeting your blood sisters for the first time, what are some kind of fun, practical things that you've learned about yourself because you've met them, and just kind of maybe vice versa?
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. Well, one of the first things was I married your dad. He plays the guitar. He's a musician. My family I was raised in, we had music in our home. We definitely did, but it wasn't. We also had a lot of sports. I guess I'll say that. And sports, I feel like were the priority if you had to put the two up against each other. And so I did both music and sports, but we just played a lot of sports. Um and so then I remember having this experience when I was in junior high. That our junior high had a talent show at the end of the year. And I had this friend from creative writing that told me, hey, me and my friends, we're going to be in a band. We're going to play at the talent show. And I was like, okay. And when I saw him play, there was just something I was like, that is so cool. And at that point, I started seeing live music a little bit of a priority in my life. My parents, they loved music. It wasn't that they didn't love it. It's not that they didn't introduce it to me, but it became something deeper to me. And so when I met your dad, it was just like this instant connection. Well, and I didn't know where that came from, and neither did my parents. I mean, you've heard the story when they heard that I was dating a guitar player. They were like, well, does he have a real job? Does he, you know? So it was, they were a little skeptical. So anyway, then meeting my aunties, two of them married musical guys. One of them married a guitar player. He's played for his whole life, and just the cutest guy, the nicest guy. The other one married a drummer at some point, um, and it just kind of made me smile a little bit because I thought I never knew where that came from. It was such a deep part of who I was, and I didn't really understand it, and it kind of made a little bit more sense meeting them. So that was kind of one thing that was really fun right off the bat. That seemed kind of cool. But getting to know my sisters, this was what was kind of interesting to me was they just kind of, I don't know. I don't know that they would say this about me. It would be really interesting if they could be in on this conversation, but I just sort of felt comfortable with them. There was just a comfort level that I didn't experience with everybody. And we did have a lot in common as far as just interest in little things like planners. Like one of my sisters really into planners, so am I. Love them. Um, One of my little granddaughters loves planners and has since she was a little kid, like a little baby. I mean, it's like things like that. Can that be genetic? I don't know. Maybe things like paper, school supplies. Just I've always loved stuff like that. So they're interested in that kind of stuff too. Travel. Um, Maybe kind of just like life outlook stuff too. Just kind of the way we view humans, our experience here, kind of the purpose of life a little bit. I feel like they just felt a little bit comfortable. I felt comfortable with the way that they thought about stuff. I'm trying to think. One thing that was very interesting was the first photo that we found of my birth mom looked, she was quite young at that time. It was right after her first husband had been killed, and she was receiving a medal in his honor. He'd gotten, maybe it was the Purple Heart. I can't remember what it was, but some honor for his bravery in Vietnam. And so she was in the newspaper. So this picture was public. It was on the public sphere on the internet. And when we pulled it up, it looked almost exactly like your sister. And it was so bizarre. Dad and I just were kind of speechless for a few moments. I don't know. I mean, it was just, I just told Dad, I said, even if we didn't have the DNA test, I think I would have said, I think this person's related to us. You know what I mean? It's just
Hmm.
so weird. But that was super fun to kind of see that, kind of see the familial. Um, like like for example, my birth mom Susan, she's got this extra little piece of skin. It gives me a gap in my teeth.
Hmm.
And Claire also has that. So just little things like that were kind of fun, physical manifestations as well as other things. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the physical stuff obviously um, has to be an interest there with just the shared DNA. But yeah, just the interests as well. So fascinating and so cool to find that later on in life than most people do, but
Mhm.
also being able to actually find it out as well because a lot of people. Well, I don't have the numbers, but I assume that there are a large number of adoptees who never get to learn anything. And
Exactly.
so,
And some people don't want to, and I respect
yeah,
that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so just being able to make those connections, just so cool and awesome.
Hmm.
Well, I want to say thank you for hopping on with me and talking about this. Such a neat story. Um, and I'm just so grateful to be able to hear it from you and from your perspective. So thanks for joining me.
Tommy, thanks for having me. You're so cute. I love you so much.
Thanks. I love you too, Mama.